My name's Eileen Baldry. I'm Professor Emerita of Criminology at UNSW, and this is Out of the Box.
So, from all of your experience working in criminology, disability justice and university leadership, what have you learned about how Australia treats young people with complex needs or disabilities when they come into contact with the justice system?
Children with complex support needs don't just drop from the heavens. They develop those complex support needs over many years as children and as young people, juveniles. How does that happen? It happens because they are not supported in the way they should be and could be and have a right to be. And what I have learned is that these children end up being managed by criminal justice. They end up being managed by the police, by courts, by the juvenile detention centres, because there's nowhere else for them, because their parents don't have the money or the knowledge. And so this has driven a lot of the work around trying to understand how that happens, why it happens, what to do about it. And that's what has driven most of my work.
From your research, it has shown that how often young people with mental health or cognitive disabilities end up in the justice system. Why do these patterns keep repeating, even though we know so much about how harmful and avoidable they are?
The patterns keep repeating because we do not do early prevention. What I mean by early prevention is that we do not take seriously the rights of disadvantaged children, the rights of children with disability, the rights of children who experience violence in their lives, violence in their families, experience homelessness, do not get a good chance at school. So all of those things could be prevented. And so the issue here is, in my view, yes, we need to try to make juvenile detention safe for children, but we shouldn't have children in detention at all. And so this is the focus, I think, of the best things we can do. That is to aim towards preventing those children ending up being arrested, being mistreated and maltreated. So we should be preventing that rather than after they've ended up being arrested, because then a lot of damage is already done.
So one of my favorite things that you've said is that the justice system ends up carrying the burden of other systems when they start to fail, such as disability services, mental health care, and housing and education. In your view, where are the biggest gaps right now?
That's a really difficult question to answer because there are so many. Can I give this answer by giving you a story? An Aboriginal girl who grew up and was in a Western New South Wales town. This girl was born with intellectual disability, cognitive disability. She had, and still has, she's a woman, but had significant other chronic health issues. Her mother, single mum, was not able to support her, didn't have the money or the wherewithal or the knowledge for that matter. And the services in that town were very poor. What happened to her? What happened to her was that at every point where we would expect a child to be supported, when they're a baby and they're 3 and they're starting to go to preschool, all of the children who are in middle class, wealthier families, and generally in many of the cities, get that support. None of that happened for her. So eventually, by the time she was 11, She was roaming the streets. Her mum couldn't control her. She was acting out, which is what people with disability do when they cannot express their need. They can't say what they need. And the police were constantly picking her up. Here's the next bit of the story. Police would try to take her to a child refuge, a children's refuge. But there was only 2 in the town, and neither of them would take her. Of course, she'd been there before, and they said, we can't handle her. So they would take her to the hospital, to the mental health unit. And they might keep her there for a night, give her some medication or something, and then release her. And we have records of police ringing around to the children's services, to the foster organisations, to all of the places they could think of to try to get this girl into a safe space. There was none. So what happened? They started putting her into police cells, initially to keep her safe, because she was only 11 and she hadn't done anything wrong, but there was nowhere for her. And this just continued to escalate until she spent most of her teenage years in juvenile detention, in and out, and then in adult detention. You can see at each point what happened to her was because she did not get, and her mother didn't get, and the community didn't get the kind of support they needed to ensure that she was safe, to ensure that she received the services that would enable and help her to live a more peaceful, happy, successful life. And so in the end, those things accumulated to be the failure of every one of those parts of the system that should be caring for and looking after children.
We continue to see reports of children being placed in isolations or conditions like solitary confinement. What worries you the most about these practices, especially for children in disability?
Any child should not be held in isolation. It's child abuse. It is against the rights of the child. It's a breach of the rights of the child. And for children with disability, it's a breach of the rights of people with disability. One of the things that has pertained across Anglo-speaking countries in particular, but probably everywhere, is the notion that you treat bad behaviour by behaving even worse to the child, rather than trying to work out why they are behaving badly. And especially children with disability, particularly cognitive disability or autism, they find it very difficult to express what the problem is, what they need. And so they act out. They often also act out in a way to try and win friends. And the notion that you would then put them in isolation, and in some places in Australia, spit hoods, cover their heads, in chains, lock them up, the notion that this is going to address that child's need and that child will end up better afterwards because it's managing their behaviour is a complete rubbish. We know there is not one piece of evidence anywhere in the world that keeping a child in isolation and treating them badly, abusing them, it's child abuse, abusing them by doing that, ends up with that child behaving better. And so, particularly for children with disability, complex support needs, they have almost always, the groups who end up in juvenile detention I'm talking about, they have almost always experienced violence in their lives prior to being arrested. And what is this doing? It is compounding it. It is making their understanding of their lives not one that leads to a good life afterwards.
Now, some of the governments have often argued that isolation is needed to manage these behaviours or keep others safe. Based on evidence, how would you respond to those comments?
Look, we can keep others safe from, let's say, a child who has really significant mental health issues and disability that make them that end up with them being violent. How do you deal with that? You deal with that by supporting that child to behave in a way that can be managed. We know we can do this. We have specialists, we have experts in occupational therapy, speech therapy, child psychologists. We have plenty of people who know how to do that. I will go back to that story about that girl. The one time in her very young life, when she was about 13, I think, we see her disappear from our data. So we have all this data, her life data. She sort of disappears from the data for 6 months. Why? She was sent to an aunt in another town, and that aunt treated her well, helped her meet the needs that she had, listened to her, tried to get her medical support and help. During that time, she was not picked up by the police. She was not behaving in ways that people found threatening. It was mainly threatening to herself, of course. But after those 6 months, when she had to go back to her another foster carer, it all started again. I'm saying this to let you know that we can do this. We know how to do this better than by putting a child into solitary confinement, isolation, to protect others. No, in the end, it doesn't protect others. It makes that child, once they get out, more likely to offend. And the trajectory from juvenile justice into adult prison is very high.
Throughout your profession, you've contributed to many inquiries and advisory bodies over the years. From the things you've learned there, what actually helped drive real reform, and what tends to get in the way?
There are many examples of where reform has been begun and then it has been undone by the next government or by, the shock jocks saying, look, these kids are roaming around and they're going to kill us all. Of course, that's absolute nonsense. This goes back to something that social theorists, sociology, termed moral panic. What is moral panic? It is the populace being stirred up with outrageous stories saying, these kids are out of control, they're going to murder you, they're stealing everything, when in fact that is not what's going on. Now, moral panic then develops into governments feeling they're being forced into a law and order approach.
Given the federal government's responsibilities for disability rights, social services, and international human rights obligations, what role do you think it should play in improving youth justice?
One, they could strengthen the NDIS's justice unit. So there is a justice unit in NDIS that works well with the prisons. Now, they should be working extra hard, I think, with children, because almost every child who ends up in juvenile detention has some form of disability or mental health issue. So this is that territory. So that's one thing. But the most important thing they could do would be to work with the community services and health departments to try and ensure that the preventive approaches are used at the beginning rather than after the fact.
Now, the topic of youth justice and disability is a very nuanced one, as I'm sure you've come to understand. What would you want people who are just beginning to learn about these issues to understand the most?
It is possible to prevent those children who are at high risk of ending up being involved with the police, being involved with criminal justice, if we do the kinds of things I've been talking about. Evidence is overwhelming that works. Evidence is overwhelming that locking them up doesn't work. And especially locking them up and keeping them in solitary confinement, isolation, especially doesn't work. I want everyone to know that we can do this, and we can do it with the services and the supports we already have. We don't have to create new ones. We just need to use them in a way that assists those particular children, but not by stigmatising them, by providing these kind of services to everybody in the community so that everyone is universally able to flourish, not just those who have the money to do so.
Thank you so much for giving up your time for this interview. It's been absolutely great having you.
You're very welcome, and I hope that everybody watches it.
Okay, perfect. That was